I came home expecting to rest, but instead I found my life sitting on the sidewalk in 2 worn suitcases and a note that said, "Don't come back." For a moment, I thought it belonged to someone else, that maybe the driver had dropped the wrong luggage at the wrong house. But then I saw my name written in my own careful handwriting on the old brown tag I'd kept for over 20 years. And just like that, something inside me went quiet. I stood there longer than I should have, the late afternoon sun pressing warm against my back while a light breeze lifted the corner of that piece of paper taped to the top suitcase, as if it wanted me to read it again to make sure I understood. Don't come back. No explanation. No signature. Just those 3 words, sharp and final. The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left 3 days ago. White siding, blue shutters, the small flower bed I'd planted every spring still lining the walkway. But something felt different, like the air itself had decided I didn't belong there anymore. I set my purse down slowly and walked toward the front door, my shoes making that familiar soft crunch against the gravel path I had swept 100 times before, and I reached out, pressing my palm flat against the wood, half expecting it to open the way it always had. It didn't. The door was locked. I knocked once, gently at first, then again a little firmer, the sound echoing back at me in a way that felt strangely distant. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. I glanced up at the second-floor window, the one that used to be my bedroom, and for a brief second I thought I saw the curtain shift, just a flicker like someone had been standing there, and stepped back. I didn't call out. I didn't pound on the door. I just stood there, my hand still resting against the surface that used to mean safety, and let the silence settle around me. A car passed slowly down the street, the driver glancing over, curiosity written plainly across his face, and I realized how it must look. An older woman standing in front of a house that no longer welcomed her, her belongings neatly placed outside like something already decided, already finished. I walked back to the sidewalk and picked up the note again, reading it one more time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel something, anger, confusion, anything at all, but there was nothing. Just a stillness, deep and steady, the kind that comes when something important breaks without making a sound. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse, then reached for the handle of my suitcase, straightening it upright, as if I were simply arriving somewhere new instead of being erased from somewhere old. I didn't look back at the house again. Not yet. Because in that moment, standing there with everything I owned reduced to what could fit inside 2 suitcases, I understood one thing with perfect clarity. This hadn't happened by accident. I walked to the corner of the street before I stopped. Not because I was tired, but because I needed distance, just enough space to think without that house behind me breathing down my back. The wheels of my suitcase rattled softly over the uneven pavement, a sound that felt too loud in the quiet neighborhood I had lived in for over 30 years, a place where I knew every mailbox, every cracked driveway, every neighbor who watered their lawn at exactly 6 in the evening. And yet, as I stood there, it felt like none of it recognized me anymore. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, holding it in my hand for a few seconds before unlocking it, my thumb hovering over Daniel's name. I had called him earlier that week to tell him what time I would be getting back, and he'd said, "Drive safe, Mom," in that distracted tone he had been using more often lately, like his attention was always somewhere else, somewhere I could not quite reach. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, twice, 3 times, until it stopped and went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the screen until it dimmed, my reflection faintly visible in the black glass, older than I remembered, but steadier than I felt. I tried again, this time calling the house phone, the number that had been the same for decades, the one I used to answer while cooking dinner or folding laundry, the one that used to mean someone was always home. It rang and rang, echoing in my ear like an empty hallway, until it too fell silent. No answer. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked down the street, noticing the small details I had overlooked before, the way Mrs. Carter's curtains were slightly parted, the faint outline of someone standing behind them, watching, pretending not to be watching. Across the street, a man slowed his walk just enough to glance at me before continuing on, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. I did not blame them. It was not every day they saw someone standing outside their own house with all their belongings packed and waiting, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome without realizing it. I straightened the handle of my suitcase again, adjusting it with care, as if keeping it upright would somehow keep me upright too. My mind began to move through the past few weeks, picking up small moments I had ignored at the time, the way Emily had asked about the documents in the filing cabinet, her voice light, but her eyes too focused, the way Daniel had changed the subject when I mentioned the property taxes, brushing it off with a quick, "I will take care of it, Mom," without ever looking at me directly. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, that families change, that people get busy, that I was imagining things because I had too much time to think. But standing there now, with the weight of everything I owned resting in my hands, those moments felt different, sharper, like pieces of a puzzle finally turning in the right direction. I took a slow breath, letting it out just as steadily, and for the first time since I'd seen that note, a single, quiet thought settled clearly in my mind, not loud, not emotional, just certain. This was planned. I did not go back to the house, not that day, not even to knock again, because there's a point when a door is no longer just closed, it is decided, and I have lived long enough to understand the difference. Instead, I walked to the end of the block and turned right, the same direction I used to take when I wanted a quiet moment years ago, when Daniel was still young and the house was full of noise, laughter, and things that felt permanent. It was strange how memory works, how it offers you comfort at the exact moment you realize that comfort no longer exists. I kept walking until the neighborhood began to thin out, until the houses looked less familiar, until I reached a small park with a wooden bench facing the street, and I sat down carefully, placing my suitcases beside me like they belonged there. For a while, I just watched the cars pass, each one carrying people who were going somewhere they still belonged, people who would arrive at doors that would open for them without question. I rested my hands on my lap and let my thoughts settle, not rushing them, not pushing them away, just letting them come in their own time. The last few months began to rearrange themselves in my mind, not as isolated moments, but as a pattern I had refused to see. Emily's voice, light and casual, asking where I kept the original deed to the house. The way she laughed when I told her it was locked away safely, as if she already knew something I did not. Daniel, standing in the kitchen one evening, staring at his phone while I spoke to him, nodding at the wrong moments, his responses delayed, distant. I remember the day I told them I would be taking a short trip, just 3 days to visit an old friend 2 states over, and how Emily had smiled a little too quickly, offering to keep an eye on things while I was gone, her tone polite, almost helpful, but something in it had felt rehearsed. At the time, I had ignored it, because that is what you do when you want to believe your family is still your family. I leaned back slightly against the bench and looked down at my hands, noticing how steady they were, no trembling, no hesitation, just stillness. That surprised me more than anything else, because I had expected anger, maybe even panic, but instead there was only clarity, slow and quiet, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for too long. I reached into my purse again and took out my phone, not to call Daniel this time, but to scroll through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed in years, a name my husband had insisted I keep, even after he was gone. I stared at it for a moment, remembering the conversation we had had long ago, the way he had said, "If anything ever feels off, do not wait, do not assume, just call." Back then, I had laughed it off, telling him he worried too much, that everything was fine, that our son would always do right by us. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening as it rang, my gaze fixed on the street ahead, calm, focused, certain, because now, for the first time, I was no longer asking what had happened. I was ready to find out how far it went. The line clicked once, then a second time, and just as I was about to lower the phone, a calm, familiar voice answered, steady and unhurried, the kind of voice that had handled difficult situations without ever raising its tone. "This is Harrison." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but to steady the moment, to anchor myself in something that still felt reliable. "It is Margaret Collins," I said, my voice even, matching his. There was a short pause on the other end, not confusion, but recognition, followed by a shift so subtle most people would have missed it, a quiet alertness. "Margaret," he replied, "it has been a long time." I looked out at the street, watching a car pass slowly, its reflection sliding across the surface of a parked vehicle like a shadow that did not belong to anything solid. "I need to ask you something," I said, choosing each word carefully, not rushing, not explaining more than necessary. "Has anything been changed regarding my house? Any documents, any transfers, anything filed recently?" Another pause, slightly longer this time, and I could almost hear him leaning back in his chair, considering the question the way he always did, thoroughly, without assumptions. "Not that I'm aware of," he said finally, "but I have not checked the records in some time." "Why are you asking?" I let a second pass before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the words to land exactly as they should. "Because I came home today and my belongings were placed outside. I was left a note telling me not to return." The silence that followed was different, no longer neutral, but sharpened, focused. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet weight. "Stay where you are," he said. "Do not confront anyone. Do not attempt to enter the house. I will look into this immediately." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "I'm not planning to confront anyone," I replied, and that was the truth. There was nothing to gain from knocking on a door that had already been closed with intention. "Margaret," he added, and there was something else in his tone now, something that reached back years to conversations I had nearly forgotten. "Do you remember the arrangement your husband insisted on before he passed?" I felt that same stillness settle deeper, not confusion, but recognition beginning to form at the edges. "I remember he handled things," I said slowly. "He always said everything was taken care of." Harrison exhaled softly, not a sigh, but the release of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. "He did more than take care of things," he said. "He made sure that nothing could be taken from you without your knowledge." I tightened my grip slightly on the phone, not out of fear but focus. "Then I think something is being attempted," I replied. "Or already has been." "We will find out," he said. "Give me 1 hour. I will call you back with details." The line went quiet after that, and I lowered the phone slowly, placing it back into my purse with the same care I had used for everything else that day. The air around me felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, as if the shape of what had happened was beginning to come into view. I looked down at my suitcases, then back toward the direction of the house, still out of sight from where I sat. And for the first time since I had read that note, a single thought settled with complete certainty. They had made a move, but they had no idea what they had moved against. I did not move from that bench, not because I had nowhere to go, but because for the first time that day, I understood that moving too quickly would only benefit them. So I stayed still, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my suitcase, my posture calm, composed, as if I were simply waiting for someone to arrive, not someone who had just been removed from her own home. The sky above had begun to shift toward early evening, the sunlight softening into that golden tone that usually made everything feel warmer, more forgiving, but there was nothing warm about what had happened, and I did not try to pretend otherwise. Instead, I let my mind return to something I had not thought about in years, a quiet conversation I once had with my husband at our kitchen table, long before any of this, back when life still moved in predictable ways. He had been unusually serious that evening, his hands folded in front of him as he looked at me with that steady expression he used when he had already made a decision. "Margaret," he had said, "if anything ever feels off in this family, I need you to trust that feeling, even if it comes from someone you love." At the time, I had smiled, reaching across the table to reassure him, telling him that our son would never put us in a position like that we had raised him better. He had not argued. He had simply nodded, as if he expected that answer, and then he had added something else, something I did not fully understand until now. "I have arranged things in a way that protects you," he said. "Not just from strangers, but from mistakes people might make when they forget what matters." I had not asked for details. I trusted him. That was how our marriage worked. Now, sitting there with everything reduced to 2 suitcases and a single unanswered question, those words felt different, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but precise, intentional. I reached into my purse again and checked my phone, not because I expected a message, but because I was measuring time, counting the minutes since I had spoken to Harrison. 23 minutes. Not long, but long enough for my thoughts to settle into something sharper. I began to consider what Emily and Daniel must be doing at that very moment, inside that house, moving through rooms that still held my things, my furniture, my memories, acting as if ownership could be decided by a note and a locked door. I pictured Emily walking through the living room, perhaps already rearranging things, touching objects that did not belong to her with a confidence she had not earned. I pictured Daniel following her lead, quieter, uncertain, but not stopping her, not questioning what they had done. That part did not surprise me as much as it should have. Over the past few years, I had watched him slowly step back from decisions, letting Emily speak first, letting her guide conversations, letting her define what was reasonable and what was not. It had happened gradually, so gradually that I had almost missed it, telling myself it was just the natural shift of a man building his own family. But now, looking at it from where I sat, the pattern was clear, deliberate, and far from natural. I exhaled slowly, letting that realization settle without resistance. There was no anger in it, not yet, only clarity, and clarity was far more useful. I adjusted the position of my suitcase again, aligning it neatly beside the bench, then rested my hands in my lap, waiting, not as someone defeated, but as someone who understood that the next move mattered far more than the first. The call came exactly 48 minutes after I'd spoken to Harrison. Not an hour, not rushed either, but precise like everything he had ever done. My phone rang once, and I answered immediately, lifting it to my ear without hesitation. "Margaret," he said, his tone no longer neutral, but controlled in a way that told me he had already found something important. "I have reviewed the property records, the trust filings, and the latest activity tied to your address." I did not interrupt. I let him continue. "There has been an attempt to initiate a transfer," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "Not completed, but initiated. The documents were submitted 2 days ago." 2 days ago. That would have been the morning after I left town. I looked down at my hands, still steady, resting in my lap, and felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper. "Who submitted them?" I asked, my voice even. There was a brief pause, not uncertainty, but confirmation. "Your son's name appears on the filing," Harrison said, "but the supporting documents raise concerns. The signatures do not match prior verified records. There are inconsistencies that would not pass a thorough review." I let that sink in, not as a shock, but as a piece of a larger pattern now fully visible. "So it is not valid," I said. "Correct," he replied. "Not valid, not enforceable, and not yet approved. It is currently under review, which means it can be stopped." I exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. "And the house," I asked, "is still exactly as it was arranged?" Harrison did not hesitate this time. "Yes," he said. "The property is held under the trust your husband established. You are the sole beneficiary with full lifetime rights. No transfer can occur without your direct authorization and verified consent. What was attempted here cannot override that." I closed my eyes briefly, not because I needed reassurance, but because I recognized the shape of the truth now, complete and undeniable. They had not just acted impulsively. They had tried to formalize it. "What do you recommend?" I asked. His answer came without delay. "Do nothing publicly," he said. "Do not confront them yet. Let the filing remain under review. I will flag it for immediate investigation, which will delay any further action on their part. In the meantime, I suggest you allow them to believe their plan is progressing." I opened my eyes and looked out at the street again. The same steady flow of cars, the same ordinary movement of a world that had not changed, even if mine had. "And then," I said. "Then we respond properly," he replied, "with documentation, with authority, and at the right moment." I nodded once, even though he could not see me. "All right," I said quietly. "I will wait." The line went silent after we ended the call. I lowered the phone once more, placing it back into my purse with the same careful motion as before. For a few seconds, I did not move. I simply sat there, letting the information settle into place, each detail locking into the next until there were no gaps left, no uncertainty, no need for speculation. Then, slowly, I stood up, adjusting the handle of my suitcase, aligning it beside me as I had done before. The weight of it felt different now. Not heavier, but purposeful, like something I was carrying by choice rather than something forced upon me. I glanced once in the direction of the house, still out of sight, and allowed myself a single, quiet thought, clear and steady. They believed they had removed me, but in truth they had only revealed themselves. I did not return to the house that night, and I did not look for a place that felt permanent either, because permanence was not what I needed anymore. I walked 2 blocks past the park and found a small hotel I had driven by countless times without ever noticing. The kind with a simple sign, a quiet front desk, and a parking lot that held more silence than cars. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older, something settled, like the building had seen many people pass through without asking questions. The woman at the desk looked up as I approached, her expression neutral, polite, the way people look at strangers they expect to leave soon. "Just one night," I said, placing my card on the counter before she could ask. She nodded, typing slowly, her fingers tapping in a steady rhythm that matched the pace of everything else in my life now. When she handed me the key, I took it with a small thank you and walked down the hallway without hesitation, my suitcase wheels rolling softly against the carpet, muted, controlled. The room was simple, a bed, a chair, a small table by the window, nothing personal, nothing familiar, and that was exactly what I needed. I set my suitcase down near the wall, not opening it, not yet, and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting loosely in my lap as I looked around the room. For a moment, there was silence, complete and undisturbed, and in that silence, I felt something settle fully into place, not sadness, not even loss, but distance. A clean distance between what had been taken and what still remained mine. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, not to call anyone this time, but to turn it over in my hands, thinking carefully about what Harrison had said, about the filing, about the signatures that did not match, about the fact that nothing had actually changed, no matter how much Emily believed it had. That detail mattered more than anything else, because it meant that everything they were doing inside that house was built on assumption, not authority. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the parking lot below, a single car pulling in, headlights cutting. Briefly through the dim light before shutting off. Ordinary. Everything still ordinary. And that was the advantage. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the bed, sitting down again with the same measured calm. I began to think not about what had already happened, but about what would happen next, about timing, about presence, about the difference between reacting and allowing someone to reveal themselves completely. If I returned too soon, they would retreat, adjust, find another way. But if I waited, if I gave them space, if I let them believe that I had accepted what they had done, then they would continue. They would become comfortable, careless, certain. And certainty, when it is misplaced, has a way of exposing everything. I leaned back slightly, resting against the headboard, my eyes closing for just a moment, not in exhaustion, but in quiet focus. For the first time since I had seen my belongings on that sidewalk, I was no longer thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what they had overlooked, and more importantly, how long I was willing to let them believe they had won. I woke before the alarm, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, organizing, measuring, deciding. The room was still dim, the early morning light just beginning to press through the edges of the curtain, soft and quiet, like it was careful not to disturb anything. For a few seconds, I lay still, listening to the silence, the unfamiliar kind that comes from being in a place that does not know you, a place that holds no memory of who you are or what you have been. Then I sat up, slow and deliberate, placing my feet on the floor as if I were stepping into something planned, not something forced. I did not rush. There was no need to. I walked to the small table by the window and poured myself a cup of coffee from the machine, the smell rising gently into the air, grounding, steady. I held the cup in both hands and stood there, looking out at the parking lot, watching as a few cars came and went, each person moving through their morning with purpose, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in mine. I thought about the house again, not with attachment, but with clarity, picturing what it must look like now, the same walls, the same furniture, but with a different kind of presence inside. Emily would be moving through the rooms with a sense of control, touching things that did not belong to her, as if they always had, her confidence growing with each hour that passed without interruption. Daniel would be there too, quieter, less certain, but present enough to make it feel real, to make it feel justified. They would not be waiting for me to return. They would be adjusting to the idea that I would not. That assumption was important. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the cup down, reaching for my phone as I did. There were no missed calls, no messages, no attempt from either of them to explain, to apologize, or even to check if I had somewhere to go. That absence told me more than anything they could have said. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was not a moment of anger or impulse, but a decision they had both accepted. I scrolled briefly through my recent calls, stopping at Harrison's name, not to call him again, but to remind myself of what had already been confirmed. The filing, the signatures, the failed attempt, the protection that was still firmly in place. Nothing had been taken from me, no matter how convincing their actions might appear. That was the difference between appearance and reality, and it was a difference they clearly did not understand. I set the phone down and walked back to my suitcase, unzipping it slowly for the first time since I had left the house. Inside were the things I had packed for a short trip, clothes neatly folded, a small bag of toiletries, nothing that suggested I would not be returning. I ran my hand lightly over the fabric, then closed it again, not because I did not need what was inside, but because I was not ready to unpack into something temporary. This was not where I would settle. This was where I would wait. I straightened up and adjusted my posture, the same way I used to before walking into a room where something important needed to be handled, and I let that same quiet certainty settle back into place. They were moving forward, believing. The situation had already been decided. But decisions, when built on something false, do not hold. And the longer they continued, the more they would reveal not just what they had done, but how far they were willing to go. I picked up my phone again, this time opening a blank note, not to write a message, but to begin listing what I would need, names, dates, details, small things that might seem insignificant on their own, but would matter when placed together. I did not need to act yet. I only needed to be ready. And as I stood there in that quiet room, with the morning fully arriving outside, and everything still appearing ordinary, I understood that what came next would not depend on what they believed. It would depend on what I allowed them to believe. I did not send a message, and I did not call again, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of pulling the truth to the surface faster than questions ever could. Instead, I spent the morning moving through small, deliberate actions, each one chosen with care, each one serving a purpose that was not immediately visible. I left the hotel for a short while, walking to a nearby cafe, where I ordered breakfast I did not really need, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that cooled faster than I drank it. Around me, people spoke in low voices, laughed, checked their phones, lived their ordinary lives without interruption, and I watched them the way you watch something from behind glass, present but not part of it. I took out my phone and opened my notes again, adding more details, times, dates, small observations that had seemed unimportant before, but now carried weight. The exact day Emily asked about the deed. The evening Daniel avoided my question about the property taxes. The morning I left town and the way she stood in the doorway, smiling just a little too long. None of it had meant anything on its own. Together, it formed something else entirely. I closed the note and set the phone down, letting my fingers rest lightly against the table as I considered the next step, not what I would do, but what I would allow them to do. Because by now, they were not waiting anymore. They were acting. I could see it clearly, even without being there. Emily moving with growing confidence, perhaps already making calls, speaking to contractors, discussing changes, using language that assumed ownership, that assumed permanence. Daniel following along, quieter, but not stopping her, not questioning the pace or the certainty. And with each hour that passed without resistance, their belief would deepen. That was what I needed. Not their hesitation, but their certainty. I finished my coffee slowly and returned to the hotel. The same quiet hallway, the same neutral room waiting for me without expectation. I set my purse down and sat at the small table, opening my phone once more, this time not to write, but to check something simple. My email. There it was. A notification from the county records office, time-stamped late the night before. A standard confirmation, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just an automated message acknowledging that a document submission tied to my property was under review. I read it once, then again, noting the details, the reference number, the language used. It confirmed what Harrison had already told me, but more importantly, it confirmed something else. They had gone far enough to believe it would work. I locked the phone and placed it back on the table, then leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together loosely. There was no rush now. Everything was already in motion, and stopping it too early would only give them time to adjust, to retreat, to hide what they had started. But if I waited, if I allowed them to continue, if I gave them just enough time to become comfortable, then whatever came next would not need to be forced. It would unfold on its own. I glanced at the door of the room, closed, quiet, unchanged, and then back to the window, where the light had shifted slightly, marking the slow passing of time. They believed I was gone. They believed the house was theirs. And most importantly, they believed no one was watching. That belief would do more than any confrontation ever could. It would make them careless. And careless people reveal everything. I waited one more day before I made my next move, not because I needed more time, but because they did. By the second morning, the silence from their side had become complete. Not a missed call, not a message, not even a single attempt to explain what had happened. And that absence told me everything I needed to know. People who believe they have done something temporary reach out. People who believe they have done something final do not. I stood by the window of the hotel room, watching the same parking lot, the same quiet rhythm of strangers coming and going, and I let that realization settle without resistance. Then I reached for my phone and called Harrison again. He answered on the second ring. "It is time," I said simply. There was no need for explanation. He understood. "The review has been flagged," he replied. "The filing will not proceed, and an official notice has been issued requesting verification from all listed parties. That includes you." I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. "Good," I said. "Then they will be expecting something." "They will," he confirmed. "And when they receive that notice, their reaction will tell us more than any document could." I ended the call and set the phone down, then walked to my suitcase and opened it fully this time, not to unpack, but to take out something specific. A folder. Plain, unremarkable, the kind most people overlook. Inside were copies of documents I had not needed in years, record my husband had insisted I keep, each one organized, dated, and verified. I flipped through them slowly, not searching, but confirming, reminding myself of what was already in place. When I closed the folder again, I felt that same quiet certainty return, stronger now, sharper. I dressed with care, choosing simple clothes, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything other than an ordinary visit. Then I picked up my purse, my phone, and the folder, leaving the suitcases where they were. I did not need them for what came next. The drive back to the neighborhood was calm, almost familiar, the same streets, the same turns, each one bringing me closer to a place that had not changed physically, but had revealed something entirely different beneath the surface. When I turned onto my street, I slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but observation. The house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged from the outside, but there was a car in the driveway that had not been there before, and the front curtains were drawn differently, a small detail most people would miss, but not me. I parked across the street, not directly in front, and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I did not get out immediately. Instead, I watched. After a few seconds, the front door opened, and Emily stepped out, her posture relaxed, her movements unhurried, as if she belonged there without question. She paused on the porch, glancing briefly down the street, her gaze passing over my car without recognition, without concern, and then she turned back inside, closing the door behind her. I waited another moment, then reached for the folder beside me, placing it neatly into my purse before opening the car door. The air felt the same as it had the day before, but I was not. I walked across the street at a steady pace, my steps measured, controlled, stopping just short of the front door I had stood outside of before. This time, I did not hesitate. I raised my hand and knocked, once, firm and clear, the sound carrying through the house with a certainty that could not be ignored. Inside, I heard movement, quick, uncertain, followed by a pause, as if whoever was there had not expected that sound. Then footsteps approached, and the door opened. Emily stood there, her expression shifting in an instant from confusion to something else, something tighter, less certain. I met her eyes without raising my voice, without changing my expression, and spoke only one sentence. "We need to talk." Emily did not step aside immediately, and for a moment, she simply stood there holding the door halfway open, her hands still gripping the edge as if she could control the situation by controlling that space between us. "Margaret," she said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes, "we did not expect you back so soon." Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was something underneath it now, something uncertain that had not been there before. I did not respond to her tone. I did not acknowledge her attempt to frame the moment. I simply looked at her and repeated, just as evenly as before, "We need to talk." That was when Daniel appeared behind her, stepping into view slowly, his expression caught somewhere between surprise and discomfort, as if he had been hoping to avoid this exact moment. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter, less certain, and for the first time since I had arrived, I saw something real in his face, not confidence, not certainty, but hesitation. I shifted my gaze to him briefly, then back to Emily, maintaining the same calm presence, the same steady posture. "This will not take long," I said, not asking for permission, not waiting for agreement. After a short pause, Emily stepped back just enough to allow space, her hand releasing the door as she moved aside. I walked in without hesitation, crossing the threshold at a measured pace, my eyes taking in the room in a single glance. Small changes, subtle but deliberate. A chair moved slightly closer to the window. A different arrangement of items on the table. Nothing dramatic, but enough to show intention, enough to show that they had already begun to make the space their own. I set my purse down gently on the table, then turned to face them both, standing upright, composed, leaving no space for misunderstanding. "You submitted a property transfer request 2 days ago," I said, my voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear. Daniel's expression shifted immediately, his eyes flicking toward Emily before returning to me, uncertainty now fully visible. Emily, however, held her posture, her chin lifting slightly as if she had prepared for this possibility. "We were handling things," she said, her tone controlled, defensive without being openly confrontational. "The house is too much for you to manage on your own." I let a brief silence follow her words, not interrupting, not reacting, allowing the weight of what she had said to settle in the room. Then I reached into my purse and took out the folder, placing it carefully on the table between us. "The filing is invalid," I said. "The signatures do not match verified records, and the request is under review." Daniel took a small step back, his shoulders tightening slightly, while Emily's expression shifted again, this time more subtle but unmistakable. Not surprise, recognition, and more importantly, I continued, opening the folder just enough to reveal the documents inside without pushing them forward. "The property cannot be transferred without my direct authorization. It is held in a trust that you do not control." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more precise. Daniel looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes entirely now, while Emily remained still, her posture rigid, her composure holding, but just barely. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hand on top of it, not pressing, not claiming, simply anchoring it there. Then I spoke one final time, my voice unchanged, calm, steady, certain. "You made a decision without understanding what you were doing." I paused briefly, meeting her gaze directly, holding it without effort. Now we were going to correct that. Daniel was the first to move, but not forward, not toward me, only slightly to the side as if he needed distance from the words that had just settled in the room. His hand brushed against the back of a chair, steadying himself in a way he probably did not realize. "Mom, we thought," he began, but the sentence did not finish. Not because I interrupted, but because even he seemed to hear how empty it sounded before it could reach the end. Emily did not speak immediately this time. She remained standing where she was, her posture still controlled, but the confidence she had held at the door had shifted into something tighter, something that required effort to maintain. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make it clear that I was not there to argue, not there to debate, only there to state what was already true. Then I opened the folder fully and turned it toward them, not pushing it across the table, only making it visible. "These are the documents your father put in place," I said, my tone even measured. "They were designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation." Daniel stepped closer now, slowly, his eyes scanning the pages without fully understanding them, but understanding enough to know they were real, that they were not something I had prepared overnight. Emily's gaze followed, sharper, more focused, reading more carefully, searching for something she could challenge, something she could use. "This does not change the fact that the house is too much for you," she said finally, her voice controlled again, but now it carried a different weight, less certainty, more insistence. I looked at her for a moment, not dismissing her words, but not accepting them either. "That is not your decision to make," I replied, simply, without emphasis, without confrontation. Daniel lowered his gaze again, his shoulders tightening as if the space around him had become smaller, more difficult to stand in. "We were just trying to help," he said quietly, but even he did not sound convinced. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it once more, grounding the moment, keeping it from drifting into something unnecessary. "Help does not begin with a note on the sidewalk," I said. The words were not harsh, but they did not need to be. They landed exactly as they were meant to. Emily inhaled slightly, her composure holding, but only just her fingers tightening briefly at her side before relaxing again. "We did what we thought was best," she said. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "And now you understand that what you thought was best does not stand," I replied. Another silence followed, longer this time, heavier, the kind that forces people to confront what they have done without the distraction of argument. Daniel finally looked up at me, his expression no longer uncertain, but unsettled, as if something he had believed without question was now shifting beneath him. Emily did not look away, but her stillness had changed, no longer confident, no longer controlled in the same way, but held in place by the realization that the outcome she had assumed was no longer certain. I reached for my purse, lifting it from the table with the same steady motion I had used when I arrived, then paused briefly, looking at both of them, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. "You have until the end of the week to return everything in this house to exactly the way it was," I said. "No changes, no removes, no further actions." I let the words settle before adding, just as calmly, "After that, we proceed formally." I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. The silence behind me, as I turned toward the door, said more than anything they could have offered. And as I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, I understood that this was no longer about what they had tried to take. It was about what they had revealed and what they would now have to face. I did not drive far after I left the house, only far enough to put distance between myself and what had just happened, not distance to escape, but distance to observe. I parked at the end of the same quiet street where I had stood the day before, the place where everything had begun to shift, and I turned off the engine, letting the silence settle around me once again. The house was still visible from where I sat, unchanged on the outside, calm, ordinary, the kind of place that gave no indication of what had taken place inside its walls. I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel and watched for a moment, not expecting anything dramatic, only watching for movement, for small signs, for the subtle changes that reveal more than words ever could. After a few minutes, the front door opened again, slower this time, and Daniel stepped out onto the porch. He did not look around right away. He stood there for a second, his posture different now, less certain, as if the ground beneath him no longer felt as steady as it had the day before. Then he stepped down and walked toward the driveway, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, scanning the street in a way that suggested he was looking for something he had not needed to look for before. Emily appeared behind him moments later, her movements sharper, quicker, her presence still controlled, but no longer effortless. She said something to him, her voice too low for me to hear, and he nodded, though not convincingly, not with the same quiet agreement I had seen so many times in the past. I watched them for a few seconds longer, then reached for my phone and checked the time, not because I needed to know it, but because I was marking the moment, placing it exactly where it belonged. This was the point where certainty had begun to crack. I started the car again, not in a rush, not with urgency, and pulled away from the curb with the same steady motion I had carried through everything else. I did not need to return immediately. I had already said what needed to be said, and more importantly, I had given them something they could not ignore time, but not the kind of time they had expected. This time was not for them to take control. It was for them to understand what they had done. I drove back toward the hotel, the road stretching out ahead of me in a quiet, uninterrupted line, and I let my thoughts settle into something final, something complete. I was no longer thinking about the note, or the suitcases, or even the moment I had stood outside that door. Those things had already served their purpose. They had revealed exactly what needed to be revealed. What remained now was not confusion, not even confrontation, but resolution. When I returned to the hotel, I walked inside with the same calm presence I had carried since the beginning, passing through the lobby without pause, without hesitation, and entered my room, closing the door softly behind me. The space felt different now, not temporary, not uncertain, but controlled, like a place chosen rather than a place I had been forced into. I set my purse down and stood still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, letting the quiet settle one last time. Then I reached for my phone and placed it on the table, not waiting for it to ring, not expecting a call, because whatever came next would not arrive in the form of a conversation. It would come in actions, in corrections, in consequences that could not be undone or explained away. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot again, the same ordinary scene, the same passing cars, and I allowed myself a single quiet thought, clear and steady, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. They believed they had ended something. In truth, they had only begun it.